They say real heroes are often the quiet ones, the ones who don't ask for recognition, who carry their battles in silence, and who sit in the back while others take the spotlight. Yet, when the truth comes out, the weight of their sacrifice humbles everyone around them. Today, I want to share with you a story of such a man, a story not about medals or headlines, but about service, sacrifice, and a dignity so deep it could never be ignored. If you believe true honor is earned in silence, stay with me until the end of this story. And if it touches your heart, don't forget to follow, like, and leave a comment so we can keep sharing untold stories like this one. The school gym smelled faintly of polish and stacked metal chairs, a place more used to basketball games than solemn ceremonies. Red, white, and blue banners hung unevenly above a makeshift stage, their edges fluttering whenever the air conditioner coughed to life. Robert Langston arrived earlier than most. His shoes were shined, though worn at the edges. His jacket was pressed with care. The patch on the sleeve almost faded to nothing. If one looked closely enough, the outline of the Eagle Airborne Division was still there, though most eyes never lingered long enough to notice. In his hand, he carried a blue folder. Inside were typed pages marked with neat handwriting along the margins, his prepared speech for Veterans Day. He had stood at many podiums before, speaking not for glory, but for remembrance. Today, however, the principal approached him before the assembly began. Clipboard in hand, she forced a polite smile. "Oh, Mr. Langston, was it? I think there's been a change. We confirmed someone else for today's talk. A younger speaker, someone the students might connect with better." Her words were careful, practiced, dismissive without admitting it. Robert didn't argue. He simply nodded once and moved aside. The folding chair they handed him squeaked as he sat at the back row. No name tag, no introduction, just the blue folder balanced quietly across his knees. He rested both hands on his cane, posture still disciplined, despite the years that had bent his back. Around him, the gym filled with restless energy. Students whispered to each other, half scrolling through glowing screens, half listening to the teachers who herded them into rows. A group of dancers in red, white, and blue scarves giggled nervously before the stage. A loudspeaker crackled overhead, announcing the program would begin in 5 minutes. Robert glanced around, not with bitterness, but with observation. He had seen real ceremonies before. Flags lowered slowly over coffins, folded triangles placed in the arms of children too young to understand. He carried those images like invisible medals, far heavier than the ribbons others wore on their chests. Near the front, the guest of honor posed for photos. Captain Chase Sanderson, tall, clean-cut, his uniform spotless, a Medal of Honor pinned to his chest. Reporters circled him, flashbulbs catching every angle. Teachers applauded politely, and a few students craned their necks for a better look. The room had already decided who the hero was. A teacher passing by offered Robert a quick smile, the kind meant for strangers, well-intentioned but shallow. "Glad you could join us, sir," she said before moving on. She did not notice the coin in his hand, a bronze token rubbed smooth from years of carrying. It bore 5 numbers and 2 letters, etched deeply, a challenge coin issued once to one man only. From across the rows, a student glanced at Robert. "Is he one of the speakers?" he whispered. His friend shook his head. "Nah, just somebody's grandpa, I think." Robert heard, but his face did not change. He had been mistaken for less before. He rubbed the coin between his fingers, steady and slow. The ceremony began with a recorded version of the national anthem, slightly off-key, echoing through tired speakers. Parents clapped softly, phones lifted high to record the dancers moving their scarves in practice patterns. Robert sat still, hands resting lightly over the blue folder. The principal stepped to the microphone, her voice swelling with staged enthusiasm. "Thank you for joining us today for our annual Veterans Day Assembly. It's an honor to welcome our distinguished guest." She gestured toward the young captain in the front row. Applause followed, louder this time, cameras snapping like bursts of artificial lightning. Captain Chase Sanderson has appeared on national television and was featured in American Valor magazine. He'll be sharing his incredible journey with us today. Students leaned back in their chairs. Some clapped because everyone else did. The captain smiled politely, rising to take his place at the podium. From the back, Robert pressed his thumb against the corner of his folder. The paper curled beneath the pressure. He did not stand, did not shift. He had written words about service, sacrifice, and the meaning of homecoming, but they would remain unread. Across the campus, outside the cafeteria, a man stood in the staff parking lot watching the assembly's live stream on his phone. Colonel Raymond Cade, retired. His granddaughter was seated in the front row, face tilted toward the stage. Raymond expected a celebration of service, something genuine. Instead, what he saw unsettled him. The camera panned briefly, catching Robert in the watch row, anonymous and forgotten. Raymond's eyes narrowed. They didn't let him speak, he muttered. Unbelievable. He scrolled to a single contact in his phone marked command. The line clicked after one ring. Go ahead, a voice answered. Langston's here. They sat him in the back. Principal said he wasn't the right fit. The pause on the other end was long enough to sharpen the air. Then the voice replied, calm and certain. Then he won't speak for himself. We'll do it for him. Tell them not to start the final anthem without us. Raymond ended the call without another word. He looked back at the school, its banners fluttering proudly above the gym doors. Inside, applause rose again as Captain Sanderson adjusted the microphone. Inside, the program was polished, practiced. Outside, something real was making its way toward the building. Robert, seated in silence, straightened slightly. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew what it meant to wait for a moment that mattered. The kind of moment where honor either lived or was lost entirely. And in that crowded gym, where his name had not been spoken once, a storm of recognition was quietly gathering, just beyond the doors. Captain Sanderson's voice carried well through the microphone, his tone smooth, his words rehearsed. And in basic training, I realized service wasn't about glory. It was about honor, about showing up when it counts. Polite applause followed, brief and restrained. Some parents leaned forward with interest, but many of the students shifted restlessly. A few nodded along because it seemed expected, but their eyes drifted toward phones dimly glowing in their laps. The speech was clean, well-polished, the kind that fit neatly into a magazine feature or television segment. Robert sat motionless in the back row. His folder rested across his knees, the paper edges beginning to curl where his hand pressed. Too long, he listened without judgment. Sanderson's words weren't wrong, but they were weightless compared to what Robert carried in silence. The principal stood at the side of the stage, her smile wide, her applause louder than anyone else's. A photographer snapped a picture just as she leaned toward the young captain, whispering something that made him nod politely before continuing. Then it happened. The gym doors creaked open. Not loud at first, but the sound cut through the captain's speech like a cold wind across a field. Heavy boots stepped onto the polished floor. One pair, then another. 3 more pairs followed, and then the unmistakable cadence of soldiers moving with purpose. Students stilled, phones lowered instinctively. Even the dancers seated near the stage straightened, scarves slipping unnoticed from their laps. Something shifted in the air, as if everyone felt a weight entering the room that had nothing to do with decorations or speeches. The figure leading the group stepped fully into view, a 4-star general in full-dress uniform, rows of ribbons and medals aligned perfectly across his chest. Behind him followed 2 aides and a Navy chief, their presence unmistakably official. No announcement had been made, no warning given. Captain Sanderson faltered mid-sentence. His polished delivery cracked for the first time. The principal hurried forward, clipboard clutched tightly in both hands. Excuse me, this portion of the assembly is... The general didn't so much as glance at her. His boots struck the gym floor with a rhythm that silenced whispers before they could form. He walked directly down the center aisle, gaze fixed not on the stage, not on the cameras, but toward the back row. As he passed, students stood without realizing why. One row, then another, rising almost instinctively as though respect were something carried on the air itself. Teachers followed, uncertain but compelled. Even the janitor at the far wall paused his work, head bowed slightly. The general stopped near the edge of the stage. His voice, when it came, was calm, yet carried the weight of command. "Mr. Langston," he said, eyes steady on Robert, "would you please join me for a moment?" Every head turned. Robert didn't move at first. He simply looked up, meeting the general's gaze without surprise. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted the folder beneath his arm and braced both hands on his cane as he rose to his feet. His movements carried no rush, no need for performance, only the steadiness of a man who had risen under fire long before. The principal stepped forward quickly, panic edging her words. "But we already had a speaker." The general turned sharply, his voice cutting clean through the charged silence. "You chose a speaker. I'm here to introduce a soldier." The gym held its breath. Captain Sanderson stepped back, his expression tightening with the understanding that the spotlight no longer belonged to him. He lowered his gaze briefly, respectful in a way that words could not cover. Robert began walking slowly down the aisle. His cane tapped lightly against the polished floor, each step echoing louder than the polite applause had minutes before. Students leaned forward, following his movement as if they had suddenly realized the real story had been sitting among them all along. When he reached the front, the general extended a hand, not to guide, but to honor. Robert accepted the gesture with a brief nod, then faced the crowd. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence carried a gravity that no microphone could amplify. The general stepped aside, boots ringing against the stage as he mounted it. He turned toward the audience, letting the silence stretch, not for effect, but because silence itself demanded recognition. "I was told this morning," he said, "that today's assembly would honor service." His gaze shifted briefly toward the principal, frozen beside the captain. "But someone confused service with visibility." The words landed heavy. Murmurs stirred through the crowd. The general gestured toward Robert, still standing firm at the front row. "So, allow me to introduce someone who never needed a microphone to lead. Sergeant Major Robert Langston." The room was utterly still. Students sat straighter. Teachers exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the moment pressed down, demanding awareness. The general's voice grew steadier, stronger. "This man trained 3 of my commanding officers. He led my first deployment team through the most hostile terrain I have ever known. He carried wounded men across minefields while bleeding himself and stayed behind to cover the evacuation alone." Gasps broke the quiet. Students turned to one another, whispers beginning to spread. "Langston? That name sounds familiar." Another leaned in. "My uncle mentioned him once, said he saved a whole unit in Kandahar." Robert stood quietly, cane in one hand, folder tucked firmly beneath his arm. His eyes did not seek approval, nor did he flinch under the sudden flood of recognition. The general looked across the sea of students. "When we were kids, we read about heroes in books. I served beside one. And this morning you handed him a folding chair." The words echoed through the gym, heavier than the banners, louder than the anthem that had played earlier. The principal's face drained of color. Captain Sanderson lowered his head further, stepping aside completely. Students shifted forward in their seats, hearts quickened by the realization that the true meaning of service was standing before them. Not announced, not photographed, but undeniable. The silence deepened, no longer empty, but charged, as though every person present knew they were witnessing a correction, one long overdue. And at the center of it all stood Robert Langston, the forgotten veteran no longer sitting in the back row. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to follow, like, and leave a comment. Your support helps us keep telling these untold stories of sacrifice and dignity. Now let's continue. The gym remained silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and held every eye forward. Robert stood beside the general, his posture straight despite the cane at his side. He had not spoken, but his presence was louder than any words echoing through the microphone. The general turned once more to the crowd. "Let me tell you about Sergeant Major Robert Langston," he began. His voice softened, not out of weakness, but from reverence. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but when he spoke, every soldier listened. He didn't seek medals. He didn't seek headlines. He sought only one thing, that his men came home alive. The room hung on each syllable. The principal lowered her clipboard, fingers trembling slightly against the edge. The young captain who had spoken earlier stood at the back of the stage, his expression respectful now, no longer touched by performance. The general continued. There was a convoy, smoke, gunfire. Roadside explosives tore vehicles apart. Men were trapped, wounded, crying out. Some didn't make it. His eyes swept across the rows of students, holding them. Langston was there. He dragged two soldiers behind a burned-out truck. One was screaming in pain, the other unconscious. He didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh odds. He acted. The gym seemed to darken, not from the lights, but from the weight of the image. Students leaned forward, their earlier restlessness gone. They were no longer in a school gym. They were standing in dust and fire beside a man who carried lives in his arms. The general's voice deepened. Radio static called out. Someone needed to hold the line. Cover fire or none of us would leave. Langston picked up a dropped rifle. He slung both men across his shoulders, torn knee and half his hearing gone. And he ran. He ran through fire. He ran until every man was safe. And when the extraction came, he stayed behind until all others had gone. Then he walked 12 kilometers alone to the pickup point. Gasps rippled through the rows. A girl in the second row pressed her hand to her mouth. A boy whispered to his neighbor, "My dad told me about this. He said some soldier saved a unit and never took credit. That's him." The whispers grew, not loud but insistent, recognition spreading like a current. Teachers exchanged looks, some realizing they had overlooked a man whose name belonged to history as much as to memory. The general stepped back, motioning toward Robert. "And this morning you gave him a folding chair." The weight of the words landed again. The principal shifted uneasily, shame written across her face. Her earlier certainty crumbled into silence. And then it happened. From the front row, a single sound broke the stillness. A young girl, her denim jacket collar pinned with a small army emblem, clapped once. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried. She clapped again, then again. The rhythm spread. Another student joined, then another. Soon the gym filled with a slow, steady applause, not loud, not chaotic, but deep. It was not the applause given to celebrities. It was the kind offered to someone whose presence demanded reverence, whose story was too heavy for cheer. Robert did not bow. He did not smile. He stood still, his hand resting over the folder, his eyes sweeping the room with quiet acknowledgement. Row by row, more students rose to their feet. Teachers followed, some wiping at their eyes. Even the janitorial staff stepped forward from the back hallway, hands folded, heads bowed slightly. No one was told to stand. They simply did. It was not about performance. It was not about headlines. It was about recognition. Long overdue, affirmed at last. The general stepped closer to Robert, his voice lowering. "Sergeant Major, you don't have to speak. You already did. Every day you showed up before the applause. Every day you carried more than anyone asked. You spoke in action, and that is louder than any microphone." Robert's grip tightened slightly on the folder. He had written words to share, carefully typed and edited, but in this moment, he knew they would never carry the same weight as the silence surrounding him now. The applause continued, then softened gradually, not because anyone wished to stop, but because the moment itself demanded quiet. The kind of quiet where hearts beat louder than hands. In the third row, a boy leaned forward, whispering with awe, "That's the man my uncle said saved them. He said they never would have made it without him." The general turned to the audience again. Some people confuse honor with recognition. They think it's found in cameras and applause. But real honor is found in sacrifice, in the men and women who gave everything without ever asking to be seen. This man, he gestured again to Robert, is one of them. Robert looked across the gym, his gaze steady. Students, teachers, parents, soldiers, faces young and old, met his eyes with respect. For the first time that morning, the quiet dignity of his presence was fully noticed. He gave a single nod, not of pride, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement, as though to say, "This is not about me. It never was." And with that, the gym, once filled with chatter, phones, and distractions, had become something else entirely. A place of remembrance, a place of respect, a place where the forgotten was finally seen for what he had always been. The applause slowed, then faded, not because anyone wished to end it, but because silence itself felt heavier, more fitting. The gym, so loud and restless at the beginning, was transformed into a sanctuary of attention. Every gaze rested on Robert Langston. The general's tone softened as he spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. That folder he carries, he said, nodding toward the blue binder under Robert's arm, holds the same speech he has given for years in small towns across the state. Schools welcomed him once, but recently someone decided he wasn't relatable enough. Yet those words were never about him. They were about sacrifice, about service, about what it truly means to come home. The principal's shoulders slumped. Her clipboard dangled loosely at her side, as though the weight of it had grown unbearable. Around her, teachers avoided eye contact, their earlier enthusiasm dimmed by realization. The general stepped aside, leaving Robert at the front of the stage. For a moment, Robert simply looked out over the rows of faces, his expression calm. He had endured worse than neglect, worse than silence. This recognition, was something different. It was not sought, but it was deeply felt. At last, the principal raised the microphone again. Her voice, once bold and rehearsed, came smaller now, almost hesitant. Sergeant Major Langston, she began, we would be honored if you would consider returning next year. Not as a guest, but as our keynote. All eyes turned back to Robert. He did not answer. He did not need to. Instead, he lifted the folder slowly, opened it, and withdrew the pages inside. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from nerves, but from the weight of years carried quietly. He turned to a nearby student, a boy in the front row, braces glinting, hands twitching nervously in his lap. Robert extended the pages. You read it, he said gently. His voice was calm, steady, carrying more than just words. This day is for you, not for me. The boy accepted the speech as if it were a sacred artifact. His fingers gripped the paper tightly, eyes wide. The room seemed to lean closer, watching the exchange. One by one, students began to approach Robert. A girl with tearful eyes hugged him quickly before retreating. A boy clasped his hand in both of his, whispering, "Thank you." Even the janitor, unnoticed by most, stepped forward, leaning close to murmur, "We see you now." Thank you. Captain Sanderson moved from the stage, his boots quiet against the polished floor. He stood before Robert, heels together, and raised his hand in a crisp salute, this time without cameras, without pretense. Robert acknowledged him with the barest nod, and the captain lowered his arm with sincerity carved across his face. Near the exit, a student asked in a hushed voice, "Why didn't he tell anyone who he was?" The general, passing by, answered without pausing, "Because people who've really lived it don't need to." Robert turned toward the chair that had been given to him at the start of the morning, a metal folding seat at the back of the gym. But now it was gone. In its place stood a wooden chair, padded and polished. A small plaque glinted on the backrest, newly attached, engraved with quiet authority, "Reserved for the quiet ones who did it all without asking." He lowered himself into the seat, his cane resting beside him, the blue folder gone from his hands, but not from his memory. Around him, the crowd began to disperse slowly, but their steps were careful, their voices subdued as though leaving a sacred space. Students whispered his name now, not with dismissal, but with reverence. Teachers exchanged glances heavy with regret. The principal stood at the edge of the stage, her eyes fixed on Robert, her earlier mistake etched deep in her expression. Robert did not linger on them. His gaze drifted across the room, not claiming the moment, but honoring it. His nod to the general earlier had said everything: gratitude, respect, acknowledgement. Nothing more was required. The boy with the braces stood nearby, still holding the speech, his lips moving as though he might read it aloud someday soon. Perhaps he would. Perhaps those words would live longer in his voice than they ever could from Robert's. The general placed his hand over his heart, offering one final gesture of recognition before departing with his aides. Captain Sanderson remained a moment longer, watching Robert, then turned toward the door with a solemn expression. The gym emptied slowly, but the atmosphere lingered, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of what had taken place. Some moments did not need to be shouted. Some moments lived quietly, forever etched in those who bore witness. Robert sat back against the wooden chair, not triumphant, not seeking validation, simply present. His life had never been about applause. It had been about service, sacrifice, and the belief that real honor did not require recognition. Yet now, at last, he had been seen, not for what he carried in his folder, but for what he carried in his silence. And in that quiet, the truth settled across every heart in the room. Some seats should never be placed in the back, because sometimes the people who say the least are the ones who have done the most. If